What do these three games have in common? At first glance, they seem pretty different. They're all different genres, have different playstyles, and are made by different developers. The simple answer is that they're all indie games, or that they were initially released in the 2010s, but the true answer is that they all include characters that break the fourth wall. The fourth wall is an entertainment concept that originated in theater and was brought into the general lexicon by the rise of the sitcom in the late 1940s and early 50s. The term is described as an invisible wall that separates the characters inside of the story from the audience. Breaking the fourth wall is any action that is directed from a character inside the story to the audience directly. TV, theater, and film have a good amount of these, but nothing can top the vast amount of fourth wall breaks found in video games, specifically indie video games. For a video game to be indie, it has to have been made by a small team of developers, sometimes even one person, on a limited budget. Indie games span a wide variety of genres, including horror, platforming, and adventure, and usually showcase more outlandish or wild ideas. Popular indie video games include the Five Nights at Freddy's games, Stardew Valley, Subnautica, Terraria, and Hollow Knight. Even Minecraft was once considered an indie game, as the initial alpha version was made by 2 people. However, Minecraft is no longer considered to be an indie game because of Mojang's huge workforce and budget. Games made by a large studio with a large budget, such as the Call of Duty series, the Resident Evil games, the Legend of Zelda games, or the Sonic franchise, are considered to be AAA games. AAA games can showcase groundbreaking gameplay and graphics, but in the end, the studios behind them are interested in making money, and are less likely to incorporate more out-there story elements, such as breaking the fourth wall. Today, I'm going to take you through 5 video games that break the fourth wall in order of oldest to newest, give you a quick summary of the fourth wall breaking characters, and then analyze them through the psychoanalytical and archetypal lens. Oh, and spoilers for the games, duh. Let's start at the very beginning with Konami's 1998 release Metal Gear Solid. Now, coming into this project, I'll admit that I didn't exactly know a lot about the Metal Gear series, despite its iconic status within the video game industry. But even I had heard of the king and forefather of fourth wall breaks himself, Psycho Mantis. Psycho Mantis shows up about halfway through the game, and instantly leaves a mark on the player by taking control of the player's companion character. After taking her down with non-lethal force, Mantis reveals himself. He then proceeds to psychoanalyze you, the player, based on how many times you've been spotted during the game, how many times you've died, and how many times you've fallen into traps. If that isn't enough, Mantis then reads your memory card and comments on the games you've been playing, and comments on how many times you've saved your game.
I can see into your mind. So, you like Suikoden. So, you like Azure Dreams. You like Castlevania, don't you? You have not said often. You are somewhat reckless.
The cutscene ends after this, and the boss fight begins. Great, you think, time to beat him up and show him you're not scared of him. Except, there's one issue. Psycho Mantis can read the player's movements and attacks accordingly, keeping him one step ahead of you at all times. The only way to remedy this is to physically change your controller's input to the second controller port. For a 90s video game on the PS1, this was groundbreaking and incredibly creepy. There had been some games before that had broken the fourth wall, but never in this way. This is because of Hideo Kojima, the game's developer. Kojima always finds ways to push the boundaries of what video games can do, even today, and inspires other developers to follow in his footsteps. Now, jumping from the 90s to the 2010s, let's look at a game that incorporated fourth wall breaks into its very core, Undertale. Undertale has got to be one of the most influential indie games of the 2010s, starting a fandom craze unlike any other seen before, except maybe for the Five Nights at Freddy's games. Releasing in 2015 and made entirely by Toby Fox, Undertale immediately stood out from other games released in the same year for its memorable pixel art style, engaging characters, and its funky music. The most memorable aspect of Undertale's popularity, however, is within its story. The freedom of choice the player has, the masterful subversion of tried-and-true gaming tropes, and the fourth wall breaks used by 2 characters in particular drive the story forwards. The first character that you meet, in fact, is one of these 2 characters, Flowey the Flower. You see, Flowey uses the fourth wall wall like it's a door. He knows exactly what the player has done, how many monsters they kill, if they reset after killing Toriel, the mother figure character, and even crashes your game entirely during his big boss fight at the end by corrupting your save file, a nightmare for most gamers. Flowey is the major antagonist of Undertale, and has a horribly tragic backstory. You see, Flowey was originally a kid named Asriel, and became how he is due to a tragic accident that resulted in his death. Somewhat related to Asriel, the other character that I want to touch on doesn't even show up unless you acquire one specific ending, the genocide ending. You see, throughout the course of the game, Undertale tracks exactly how many monsters you kill and how many you spare. To get the genocide ending, however, well, it's basically what it says on the tin. Hack and slash your way through Undertale's eccentric cast and struggle through one of the hardest boss fights in the game, and you are greeted by this. This is Kara. Kara is very much not happy with you, the player, specifically, and if you choose not to erase your game file when they present you with a choice, well, I think this clip speaks for itself. They crash the game entirely. Game crashing is a staple of fourth wall breaking in indie games, as well as file manipulation, and there's no game that delves into file manipulation more than Doki Doki Literature Club. Doki Doki Literature Club is a psychological horror game, released on September 22nd, 2017 by Team Salvato. Do not let its cutesy high school dating sim appearance fool you, this is a horror game. It makes itself very, very clear right from the get-go that this game is not suitable for children or those who are easily disturbed. Somehow, some people were still surprised when the psychological horror game actually became a psychological horror game. The 4 characters in the game, besides the main character, are named Sayori, Yuri, Natsuki, and Monika. Each girl has their own distinct personality. Monika is the club president and organizes events, Natsuki is brash and loud, Yuri is quiet and eloquent, and Sayori is quirky and aloof. Monika cares deeply about the player, and is the only character that is not dateable during the first and second acts. Everything starts out normally. You walk Sayori to school, write poems, join the literature club, but eventually things start to deteriorate. Monika begins to go about her fourth wall breaking in the middle of the first act, and does so in a way that is extremely antagonistic, even going so far as to kill off her fellow literature club members in ways that I definitely can't show in this documentary. She messes with the game files, deletes other characters from the game, and manipulates the player's cursor at times. This wasn't exactly groundbreaking for its time, but was significant enough to leave a big impression on the internet. No other game had messed with the game files so directly, even if the game files presented weren't exactly the actual game files. This was big for the modding community as well, because with access to the character files, it was easy to make and install mods for the game. There's one mod that even expands on Monika's Just Monika Act, Act 3, where she can develop sadness and anger if you leave her alone for too long. Speaking of games that make use of real-world time, let's continue onwards to OneShot. OneShot is a game that can only be played in one sitting, and follows a cat-like kid named Nico, who is on a mission to bring back the sun, a light bulb, to a post-apocalyptic world that they wake up in. It's your job to guide Nico to this goal, navigating through the dark and yet welcoming world, and making the final choice at the end that determines Nico's fate. This game is full of fourth wall breaks. In fact, the wall between you and Nico is just about gone. You, the player, and Nico are 2 separate entities within the world of OneShot, and Nico even talks to you directly throughout the game. The game is meant to be played in windowed mode, as certain parts of the game mess with your files and even your computer's background. One wall break, however, comes if you don't play the game in one shot, as the title suggests. To keep it brief and blunt, Nico dies. Yep, that's right, Nico just dies. No way of going back. A pop-up even shows up on a dark screen, reading that you killed Nico. The game places the blame directly on the player, providing a surefire way to freak someone out were they going into the game blind. Now let's jump from a game with one crucial choice at the end to a game that comments on the very nature of choice itself.
This is the story of a man named Stanley.
The settings person is the first character that you come across when you first boot up a copy of the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, released in April of 2022. This is by far technically the newest game I'm going to talk about here, since this version was released in 2022 and is a re-release and update of the original 2013 game. There is so much to talk about. Meta commentary left and right, musings about the nature of choice and free will, endings that tackle mental health issues and addiction, and even the death of the author trope. There's so much I have to say about this game, but I'm gonna have to cut down the lore babbling to a minimum so I can stay within the time limit. To pare down the lore insanely, the settings person was once an employee at the in-game company, numbered as Employee 432. 432 was the only employee free of the mind control system that the company used to keep its employees in line. The people controlling the facility had marked him as a test case, to see how far they could push a human mind until it broke. He only had one job: sharpen pencils. However, he had no pencils to sharpen. Every other employee was instructed to refuse him pencils when he asked, barring him from doing his job at all. The other employees developed a disdain for 432, viewing him as odd and unstable. This went on for an insane amount of time, until one day, employee 432 cracked. He began to murmur and chant phrases such as, "I must keep the wheel turning," and "it must go forever," and was completely unresponsive to other stimuli. After a few days of this, employee 432 disappeared entirely.
But later on in the game, the settings person that you saw at the beginning comes back, and it is the settings person is basically revealed to be employee 432. We later on realized, oh my god, what if employee 432 has been driven so psychologically mad that they become the fabric of the universe, setting things for you, and is like evaporated from off of the plane. And
as a result of this, the settings person is able to speak directly to the player and adjust the settings accordingly. They seem to harbor a neutral view towards every aspect of the game and come across as friendly, even at the end of the game during the epilogue, when you find them in the abandoned ruins of what was once the memory zone. Speaking of the memory zone, this really isn't about him, but I feel like we shouldn't mention the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe without mentioning the character that uses the fourth wall like a revolving door, the narrator. Every few minutes there's a fourth wall break with this guy. He's completely aware that he lives inside a video game and is even able to read Steam reviews left on the game's Steam page. The narrator speaks to the player through the main character Stanley, and he speaks a lot. It's through him that we learn the story of the game, laugh, cry, and venture through the meta-commentary that the game provides. In one ending, the narrator even takes Stanley to different games: Minecraft and Portal in the original 2013 release, and Firewatch and Rocket League in Ultra Deluxe. No other game on this list so heavily references other games. Psychomantis was aware of other games, yes, but T-Spot and the narrator literally drop you into them. Hey, while we're talking about the game based on analysis and narrative tropes, let's take a look at all of these characters through the psychoanalytic lens. One thing that I find interesting between all these examples is that all of the characters that break the fourth wall either take antagonistic roles or are seen as insane within the world of the game. Each of the fourth wall breaking characters seem to have let their id overcome their ego and superego and chase pleasure to such an extent that they try to branch out into the real world. Monica is a notable example of this. She lets her want for the player's love drive her to deleting her friends from existence, leaving only you and her. After all, who can get in the way when it's just Monica? The only way to defeat her, once it's just you and her, is, ironically, to delete her from the game files. Funnily enough, there's a certain sect of people that get so attached to Monica that they never actually delete her, and therefore never finish the game. You could say in this situation that the player's own id is overpowering their ego, forming a bond with a fictional character despite her very much being not real. The settings person is a notable outlier from the antagonistic trope here. Throughout the game, the settings person tries to be helpful to the player, saying that they find enjoyment in adjusting the settings to the player's exact specifications. They're a bit freaky and odd, yeah, maybe a bit off-putting, but they mean well. They never try to force anything on the player except for one specific thing, and that's playing the epilogue in the first place. They have a fixation, maybe even an addiction, on keeping the wheel turning and pumping out more versions of the Stanley Parable. They still are definitely listening to their id more than their superego, but their ego seems to have scrapped together a rough balance. The narrator is a bit of a toss-up when it comes to him being an antagonist or not. He never tries anything to actively attack or harm the players themselves, beside a few verbal jabs here and there, but takes an antagonistic role towards Stanley, the protagonist. He seems to be trying to fill the role of, as his name implies, a narrator, but struggles due to his inability to be impartial ever. Like every other character that breaks the fourth wall, the narrator has some sort of imbalance between his id, ego, and superego. He chases positive reviews of his work, even going so far as to build a literal shrine to them, and when he finds negative reviews of his work, he takes them to heart and spirals.
Honestly, I could not be bothered to play this game to full completion. The narrator is obnoxious and unfunny, with his humor and dialogue proving to be more irritating than entertaining. Unfunny! I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to make a serious work of art. Okay, let's see what this one says. While the idea for the game is good, for someone who prefers non-linear games, this preachiness gets annoying fast. Preachy? Stanley? I'm not preachy, am I? I feel like a failure. Like I let these people down. Perhaps the Stanley Parable isn't quite as sterling as I always remembered.
He actively hurts himself to try to make every single player that plays his game happy, creating a quote-unquote skip button that is implied to leave him by himself for centuries. Flowey, after his transformation into his flower form, was entirely id-motivated. He tried his hardest to be a good person, showcasing a good balance of all three aspects, but eventually the returns he was getting by being good diminished. This is when he began killing and resetting the world, over and over, and again, getting diminishing returns. He develops a lust for power, showcasing the vice grip his id has over him. He probably believes, like most addicts, that having just a little bit more would satisfy him. However, it really never will. Kara, by comparison, was id-motivated from the start. They were the one to make the plan to free the monsters that resulted in both their death and Asriel's, and only gained his help through heavy convincing. It's implied that Kara was abandoned as a child, or was neglected by their human parents, maybe leading to this psychological imbalance. Psychomantis, on the other hand, is almost entirely superego motivated. He tries to satisfy his superego by giving himself an excuse for the evil things that he does, and sees humans as disgusting things whose only purposes are pleasure and harm. The only outlier in this group is Nico. Nico really doesn't have any psychological imbalance between their id, ego, and superego. Their motivation is that they want to get home to their mother, but their ego keeps that motivation in check. Another trope that these characters fall into is the outcast role. The settings person was ostracized by their peers before they became what they are when you boot up the game. The narrator, despite seeming to be an omnipotent and omnipresent entity, doesn't have any actual friends. Monica is the only character that you are completely unable to romance during Doki Doki Literature Club's first act, and acts the way she does because she wishes to have her own route so badly. Flowey lives in the dark corners of the underground, only emerging once he can steal power for himself. Kara is locked away in one ending and in the lore of the game, making it so that some first-time players may not even realize they exist. Throughout the course of OneShot, Nico does meet other people and makes friends, but their prophesied role as the savior of their world prevents them from forming meaningful relationships with anyone but the player themselves. Psychomantis was scorned and shunned as a child by his peers and his own father for his powers, driving him to become evil. Most characters play into this trope by having a traumatic backstory. Flowey and Kara enable each other into causing an event that kills them both, the settings person was driven insane by the system they were trapped in, and Psychomantis eventually broke due to his mistreatment, resulting in him blowing up his childhood village and developing a hatred for other humans. Overall, these characters seem to fall into similar tropes and psychological patterns. The framework for a fourth wall breaking character seems to be this. An outcast who is shunned by their peers experiences a life-changing event or trauma that opens them to the reality of the world they live in and leaves them empty of pleasure and desperate to regain happiness or worth. Each of these characters and games has affected the gaming genre in outstanding ways and has pushed the form forwards. Here's to the fourth wall, and here's to those that see beyond it. Alright, reflection time. Hello. I don't have a script for this, so it's gonna be real, all over the place, but it is in the video. Great. So, basically, I learned a lot about the history of fourth wall breaking and what the fourth wall really is, technically. I learned a lot about Metal Gear Solid specifically, because I had to really look into how Psychomantis utilizes the PS1's controller ports to read the player's movements and, like, technically how all that worked in the first place. There was also a few videos that I watched that talked about how he, like, reads the player's memory card on the PS1, and in newer versions, how those pieces of dialogue even work or are put into the game. Turns out you have to input in a settings menu which games you had played on the PS1, and then it does the cutscene accordingly. I also learned a lot about OneShot. Going into this, I also didn't know a lot about OneShot. I knew it was a good game, and I knew that basically the whole thing was that you had to play it in one shot. But I didn't know anything about the story or about Nico. So writing the script was a great way to learn about the game and to understand the plot and to understand, like, how that game works as well. Because it messes with your background. It does some, like, really weird stuff in windowed mode, like bounces around. And I also learned that there's a lot of different versions of the game. Because, fun fact, it's only in the older version of the game that you can kill Nico by exiting the game without saving. I did not know that when writing the script, so that is why that error is still in there. It was great to delve into the characters that I did know psychoanalytically, that being Flowey, Kara, Monica, settings person, and the narrator, because I really enjoyed analyzing their character traits and their lines of dialogue and their actions during their respective games through the psychoanalytic lens. I thought that was really fun. And as I said in the documentary, the similarities where almost all of them are entirely id motivated, and that's why they're so antagonistic towards the player, that it's fascinating to me. I also learned a lot about what makes an indie game an indie game. As I say in the documentary, that being how many people are on the creative team, the budget. I don't think the amount of time that is spent on the game factors into that at all. But it was also interesting to learn how an indie game can go from being an indie game to a AAA game. With the example of Minecraft, because as time went on, they made a lot more money off of their game, became a internet classic, and Mojang got bought by Microsoft, which now makes them a AAA studio. I don't know if the same could be said with the Five Nights at Freddy's series. The new games are being produced by a company called Steelwool, but I wouldn't exactly call Steelwool a AAA studio. So I personally would still put the Five Nights at Freddy's games in the indie category, even though they have a very, very long history and there's a lot of them. Yeah, fun fact, during the production of this documentary, I made it on Adobe Premiere Rush, which is why some of the, still shots, the images are, like, really blurry and the zooms are really shaky for no reason. That's a Premiere Rush thing, I promise. It wasn't just me being bad at zooming in. But halfway through me cutting all the audio together, which took like 2 hours, Adobe Rush crashed and completely deleted all of my work. So I had to basically start from scratch again, and that was a great learning experience. Because, things like that are gonna happen. And, I don't know, I had a lot of fun with this project. I hope you guys liked it. And I hope that this is graded well. Wahoo! Alright. Thank you. Bye-bye.